Callum, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about religious experience.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
No worries at all. Let's dive straight in to talk about how we define this. I find this really difficult. I find it very difficult to begin the topic of religious experience. I think it's easy when you look at it from the perspective of examples that
Yeah.
particular people might have had, but yeah, I'd love to sort of know how you broach this topic with your students. If you sort of had to define a religious experience, how would you typically go about that?
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? Because we spend a lot of time talking about the different types of religious experience and critiquing it, but it's important to have an understanding of what a religious experience is.
Mm.
Um, and it's difficult sometimes to define because it's subjective somewhat
Yeah.
to the person having it. Um, when it comes to how I teach religious experience to the students that I teach, we look at several definitions of what a religious experience is, and where these come from. So, sort of a more sort of Judeo-Christian um, definition of what it might be, a more general, maybe spiritual
Mhm.
definition of a religious experience. Um, and really, from what we look at and the scholars, the people we look at, it's this idea of something that is positive or gives you some sort of knowledge or information, um, whilst having a connection that is beyond the physical,
Mhm.
uh, that perhaps involves God, um, or an understanding of something beyond us, um, is what sort of the idea of what a religious experience might be. Um, yeah, this is sort of how we look at a religious experience and what it might be seen as.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's all the interesting key words like subjective, personal, connected to that. This
Yeah,
idea that it's something not necessarily physical, but perhaps spiritual or mental, depending on how you look at it. So maybe then by definition, it's one of those things because of its inherently personal nature that we do have to delve into some of the different types of religious experiences that people might have. So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, should we start by maybe sort of identifying what some of those different types might be? Like, maybe we could start off by thinking about perhaps the word numinous, because that's a word that
Yeah.
comes up quite a lot. So what's your kind of take on that?
So, I mean, something that is numinous. So we look at William James
Yeah.
for who is a big part of this specification. He talks about religious experience and what that might be, and something that leaves us, or is connected to God, as we said, but something that leaves us feeling um, sort of in awe or wonder of
Yeah.
something, so that we maybe can't quite define,
Hmm.
um, or understand, that science can't make sense of, or that we can't prove, um, and in a scientific way. And so something that leaves us feeling in awe, wonder. Um, but then what we mean by that again is again, this comes back to this word sort of subjective of how somebody might feel after having a religious experience. What does it mean to be in awe and wonder? We can be in awe of other people.
Yeah.
Uh, we can um, uh, feel, we can have feelings of awe and wonder generally. But something that it leaves us feeling that this is something that we must sort of take notice of, or sit up and realize that there's something here that we need to understand, maybe, or try to make sense of, or at least be open to the understanding that it's something bigger than us, or that we are um, being given some information that we need to use in some way.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting to think about it from the perspective of awe and wonder, because they're the same words that come to mind for me when I hear the word numinous. But there's so many things that can leave someone awestruck that aren't necessarily religious, although they could be.
Yes.
So, you know, for example, you mentioned like being in awe of other people, like that's definitely something I think a lot of us can relate to. Or, you know, you can look at a sunset and be in awe of the beauty of the sunset without necessarily ascribing a religious significance to that, although you might do, depending on who you are. So again, it goes back to it being very, very personal. You mentioned this idea of it being difficult to describe, actually, and I think that's something that maybe we could explore in a bit more detail, because like you say with William James, and I always teach this with reference to the acronym PINT. So the 4 characteristics of religious experience. So I think it's passive, ineffable, noetic, and transient. And obviously the ineffable part is a fancy way of saying you can't put it into words. So again, that's another thing that makes it hard to study, right? If we're looking at these people that have had these experiences that they themselves can't even verbalize in a way that accurately captures what they went through, how can we actually study it? So do you have any tips for students that maybe are new to this topic, or maybe they're not new, actually, maybe they're just kind of finding it difficult? Any ways to, especially assuming that, you know, the people studying it haven't necessarily had a religious experience themselves, how they might actually get into understanding what people might have gone through, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are a lot of examples of religious experience, the different types of religious experience, either biblical or otherwise. And what I do when I teach religious experience, because I've been teaching the A level for a while now, and there used to be a separate topic called miracles a few years ago before the A level changed, and I think that lends itself quite nicely to sort of supporting the topic of religious experience, because we look at some of the people on there, some of the scholars, some of the people like Maurice Wiles and others, who talk about what miracles are as a type of experience, which also can't be explained. So these are also sort of ineffable. These are also, you know, difficult to explain and make sense of. But when looking at some of these examples, some of these miracles, or some of these conversion experiences, it's important to have a little look at not necessarily what the experience was, but how the person changed. Because as you mentioned, William James says that these are transient, meaning that they're only temporary, they're quite short experiences, but it's the after effect that is important. Or it proves the validity of the experience. So looking at people like Augustine and others who have had a type of experience, or Paul, or whoever it might be, and looking at the after effect, looking at how that person has changed, and trying to make sense of it that way, rather than looking at what's happening actually in the experience, which is often sort of quite mystical and quite sort of well, we can't explain it, it's above and beyond our understanding. So looking at the after effects and trying to understand that, and making sense of religious experiences that way, rather than what's happening then and there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think a couple of practical tips that students can take away from that is that, like you say, there's plenty of examples, biblical or otherwise, of people that have had these so-called religious experiences. And I think I'm right in saying William James said words to the effect of, it's the fruits, not the roots, or something along those lines, I think. So in other words, the effects of the religious experience, like the consequences, if you like, negative or positive, because sometimes it can be difficult, right? Like, even if we do characterize religious experiences as positive, it can be difficult, I think, for people to reconcile, especially if they've had a conversion experience. So maybe we can think about that, actually. Can you think of any examples of where people might have difficulty dealing with the after effects of, say, a conversion experience, where they've changed their faith from one to another, or they've gone from not having any faith to having faith all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So yeah, like you say, we do think of them as positive. And so if somebody did have an experience and the outcome wasn't positive, um, depending on who they are and how they feel, they might not see it as a religious experience because they haven't had a positive outcome. But in regards to that, I mean, there there were examples. There was somebody who didn't give a specific example. Starbuck, I think Edwin Starbuck, who was who said that conversion experiences don't always leave people having a positive outcome, or don't always leave people feeling positive. And that conversion experiences, he goes into quite a bit of detail talking about how they mainly take place between young adults, or within young adults and teenagers in a rebellious stage, where they are more likely to convert because they're more easily influenced. And so it's not really a conversion experience, it is a more sort of being easily led. But he also gives an example of where he says there are a group of teenagers who have a experience where they can't explain it. It's a sort of vision. And this vision is they attribute it to God, and it's telling them how to sort of change their life and live a more sort of moral life. But actually, when they start to live this life, they don't enjoy it as much as the sort of rebellious life as they did before that. Which, again, if they attribute that to a religious experience, would be an outcome that's negative for them, because they're not enjoying it as much, which I suppose also poses the question of, is a religious experience, or the outcome of a religious experience, is it supposed to be enjoyed? Is it supposed to, it's perhaps supposed to make us better people, maybe, if you could say that, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
But is it supposed to be enjoyed by us, is another question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, in fact, the example that I think is perhaps most relevant to this, at least as far as I can tell, is C.S. Lewis. So,
Yes.
there was a great film that came out, I think it came out a couple of years ago, I think it was called The Most Reluctant Convert, but I'll double check. But that's his own word, actually, his own kind of wording of this. Yeah, 2021, The Most Reluctant Convert. And that's based upon, his experience that he had in the Trinity term, as he puts it, of 1929. He's at university in his room studying, and he feels the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. So it's like he knew that he was going to be converted, but he didn't want to be. And again, he calls himself the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. And that he really had to kind of reluctantly give in to the idea that, as he puts it, God was God, which led him to kneel and pray for the first time. So I think, like you say, we can look at this in terms of what is a religious experience, if we can think about it in these terms, supposed to do to a person. And he himself actually said, and I think this is quite a good quote with reference to what you were talking about is it genuine or not? But C.S. Lewis says, if conversion to Christianity makes no improvement in a man's outward actions, so in other words, if he continues to be just as snobbish or spiteful or envious or ambitious as he was before, then I think we must suspect that his conversion was largely imaginary. So in other words, if you don't change for the better, it's not a genuine religious experience. And that, again, it invites us to think about, the multitude of different experiences that people have and how we should characterize them. I mean, another thing that perhaps we can talk about briefly is corporate religious experiences. So when they happen, that adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it? Because you can look at it and be like, well, it's a subjective thing and it's personal. But if all of a sudden you've got a big group of people, experiencing the same thing, you could tie this in with miracles as well, actually, miracles that have multiple witnesses. What does that mean? And can that count as, proof of God's existence, perhaps? If multiple people are experiencing it, might there be something to it? So yeah, I'd love to hear your opinion on that, about whether perhaps corporate religious experiences are, as it were, more reliable than individual ones.
Well, that's what we would expect, isn't it? I suppose we would think, oh, corporate religious experiences must be more reliable because it happens to more than one person, often at the same time in the same place. It's some examples. So, I mean, when we look at corporate religious experience, there are several examples that we look at that are very well known, and we start talking about the famous example, the biblical example, in the Bible, where the apostles they have this, the Holy Spirit come to them, and they start sort of speaking in other languages, other tongues, to spread the message. And during this time, during Pentecost, it's an important time in Christianity, but also it shows us that they are having a religious experience. And there are lots of people there who are witness to this, which
Mhm.
is something that many argue does add weight to these corporate religious experiences. They're not private experiences that are happening to you privately when no one can see them happen. They're actually happening then and there.
Yeah.
People are watching you. But again, whether these people are under, again, as someone like Freud would say, sort of being deluded or just sort of jumping on the bandwagon, or whatever you want to say about it. And you know, the Toronto blessing is another
Yeah.
example. And you know, where people, this, what Freud would say is mass hysteria,
Yeah.
where people are laughing and just joining in, because I suppose if you're standing in a church and someone is touched by the Holy Spirit, or the Holy
Mhm.
Spirit influences them, and they have a religious experience, and they start to experience that, and they start holy laughter, then you could argue that because they're in a church, that would be applicable to everybody, and they would also experience this, and but also at the same time, I don't know, I think if I were there and I didn't have that religious experience and everyone else was having it, how would I feel? Would I join in um,
Yeah.
and start laughing? Which doesn't it sort of takes away in some way, I suppose, the validity if that those people are faking that experience, whereas some people might be having a genuine one. I think it's still very difficult to objectively prove a religious experience, even if corporate, because again, we are human, and we want to be part of this experience, particularly if you're at church and you want to
Yeah.
connect with God. And it's happening to one person, so you yourself want to take part in it. Although speaking in tongues is a type of religious experience, and often a corporate experience that may happen to many people at church. And there was a study that was done in 2006 by the University of Philadelphia, I think it was, and they were monitoring people at a church who were speaking in tongues, and they set up their equipment, the scientific equipment. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know too much
Me
about
neither.
and connected these people to measure their brain activity when they were speaking in tongues. And it found basically that they were using different part of their brain when speaking in tongues than they would do to speak just generally in a conversation, which they found quite interesting and a little bit strange and unexpected, because they thought, you know, perhaps these people, there is a potential that they may be making it up, and
Yeah.
so we could perhaps show that. But the outcome didn't show this, and they were a little bit sort of confused as to the outcome, which for some may be further evidence of these corporate religious experiences. I hope I've tried to answer the question, and we're
Oh no,
not.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I hadn't heard of that study before.
Mm,
So I think that's really interesting, because there is a tendency, I think, for people to look and be like, you're just making it up, you're just going along with what the crowd wants. But I think it might be in some ways oversimplifying it. But yeah, I mean, I asked a deliberately difficult question. So, you know, there are lots of different ways that we can look at that in terms of reliability and so forth. But I mean, I look at the example of the Toronto blessing as well. And I think, like, if that really is God acting through people, or the Holy Spirit, to what benefit is that? Because some of the things that were happening in the Toronto blessing, and for some people, quite disturbing, like, you know, people crawling around on the floor, like barking like dogs. You know, it's like, what does that tell us about, you know, the nature of God and how God is appearing in people's lives if they're acting in that way? I mean, conversion experience is fine. You can look and be like, this person's changed their ways. I mean, a lot of people that convert happen to have been, you know, like criminals in a past life, and, you know, are changing their ways very obviously for the better, and they go and evangelize as a result. But yeah, when it comes to those kind of experiences where people look to be convulsing and having these quite, you know, on the face of it, very dramatic things happening to them, a lot of people do, I think, fairly enough question, like, why would God have that effect on people, what's going on there. So as we sort of come to the end, actually, I'd love to end on that note, because one thing that I think the spec kind of, hints at, but doesn't really go into as much detail on, is whether religious experiences do prove that God exists. Because obviously there's a whole other unit on the spec, which is about arguments for God's existence, resting upon things like the ontological argument, cosmological design, etc. But yeah, I'd love to hear your take on, how compelling religious experiences might be as potential evidence for the existence of God.
Yeah, so I think again, like you said, it is a topic where, again, that question could very well be asked in an exam. To what extent are religious experiences evidence that God exists?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, these religious experiences and what they do to people, the impact they have on people, if it is a positive experience that people attribute to God, and it lends that person to them change their life and experience better things, or give their self to God, then I mean, for that person, I think religious experiences are proof of God's existence, because they attribute that to God. They um, believe that God has chosen them,
Yeah.
um, whether it be, whatever type of religious experience it might be, whether it be a conversion experience, or someone like Paul or Augustine who changed their lives and gave themselves to God, whether it be something like a vision, or the voice of God, or whatever it might be. If you've had that experience and that has changed you, and you come out of that um, with a positive outlook, and as something that God has revealed something to you, or even people like biblical examples, Moses, for example, who, God, who God revealed something to, and gave commands to, and it was, sometimes religious experiences are not very clear, but in the regards to Moses, it was a very clear experience that
Yeah.
God wanted him to do. Um, so I feel for some people, it helps them to give them purpose, and it must come from God, and therefore, if it comes from God, God must exist. I think objectively, it's not proof to those who haven't had a religious experience necessarily.
Yeah.
Because, if you look at someone like Richard Swinburne, who looks at his principle of credulity and testimony, these two, and where he says, you should believe what people tell you unless you have evidence against that.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose if someone has lied to you over and over again, and you no longer believe that person, and then they say they've had a religious experience, you would not believe them. But if you had no cause to not believe them, and you'd always trusted them, and they said that, then perhaps you would. But I think religious experiences are perhaps better proven to those who have them, because even though the outcome of the experience is what seemed to be important by many of these scholars, the actual experience itself is the connecting to God. And so I suppose people may feel, well, I haven't had one. Why has God not picked me?
Yeah.
How comes, he's revealed himself to you, or given you this message? So I feel for those who believe, or even for those who have had a religious experience who might have not believed previously, it is evidence. But to those who don't believe, and have a reason not to trust those who tell them this, or believe that that's not sufficient evidence, then no, I don't believe it is sufficient evidence in that regard, to God's existence.
Sure. Yeah. Again, something I agree on. And I think it comes nicely full circle, actually, back to what we said right at the beginning, which is this idea that it's subjective. So while it might be very compelling evidence, knowledge for the people that have had the experience, doesn't necessarily stand up to scientific scrutiny. But again, that's a whole other thing that we could potentially explore another time. But yeah, we're going to end it there. Thank you so much, Callum. It's been fantastic to talk through this with
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much for having me, and I've really enjoyed the discussion. Yeah, thank you. It's been great and I hope this can be useful to people, to students who are studying, revising, and want to know a little bit more about the topic.
I'm sure it will be. And I'd love to have you back on because I think we've kind of only really scratched the surface with this. So maybe we could explore perhaps some specific examples in another episode. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Callum. Have a wonderful rest of the day and speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.